Frost never behaved strangely on Corvus Relay. It formed in thin white sheets near the outer wall vents, and the cleaning drones wiped it away every morning without anyone noticing. But on the night the cold pipes groaned louder than usual, the frost in cabin 4 did something it had never done before. It froze into shapes. Small shapes, curved like feet, pressed into the thin white layer in a wide ring around the narrow bed pushed against the wall. Daniel Ashworth noticed them before he noticed anything else, before the low hum of the station's air recyclers, before the faint ache in his shoulder from a double-shift fixing coolant valves. He sat up slowly and stared at the floor. 3 sets of prints, each print no bigger than his palm, with 3 narrow toes and the faint drag of a claw at the tip of each one. They circled the bed twice, then stopped in the middle of the room, right where the deck plating met in a seam. He rubbed his eyes, thinking sleep had tricked him. The marks did not move or fade. He crouched down and touched one with 2 fingers. It was real, cold, sharp-edged, undeniable. He followed the ring with his eyes, searching for where it began or ended, expecting a trail leading to the door or to the vent grate above his shelf. There was nothing. The prints did not lead in from anywhere. They simply started at the seam in the floor, as if whatever made them had walked straight up out of the deck itself. Daniel had spent 6 years fixing machines on this station, and he knew every panel, every access line, every stretch of pipe under every floor. He knew, without needing to check, that the seam beneath his bed led to an old environmental duct, one he had personally sealed months ago after a coolant leak made it unsafe to use. He had signed the maintenance report himself. Sealed and empty, the report said. He remembered writing those exact words. He pulled on his boots and knelt beside the bed, running his hand along the seam until his fingers found the small recessed catch he had installed. It was unlocked. Not broken, not forced. Unlocked, as though someone had simply opened it and forgotten to close it properly. His stomach tightened in a way he did not like. Station protocol was clear about unexplained breaches. Report first, investigate second. He knew the rule. He had recited it to new engineers a dozen times. He opened the hatch anyway, before he could stop himself. Cold air rose up from the duct, carrying a smell he did not recognize, faintly metallic and faintly alive. He reached for the small hand light clipped to his belt and shone it down into the narrow space. For a moment he saw nothing but old cable trays and dust. Then something in the corner shifted, and 3 pairs of eyes caught the light and threw it back, silver and round and afraid. Daniel went very still. They were small, smaller than his forearm, with damp, dark scales that had not yet hardened, folded wings pressed close against narrow backs, and thin tails curled tightly around their own bodies for warmth. One of them let out a sound, not quite a cry, not quite a hiss, somewhere between the two. The other 2 pressed closer against it, trembling. He had read about creatures like this only once, in an old survey file about the dead world below the station. A world the Concord archives listed as home to a species wiped out generations ago in a war before he was born. The file had called them the Vornith. The file had also called them extinct. Daniel looked at the 3 shivering shapes in the duct beneath his bed and understood, all at once, that someone had made a mistake somewhere, or that the archive itself was wrong, or that something impossible had simply happened anyway, the way impossible things sometimes did when nobody was looking. He thought about calling it in. He thought about the correct channel, the report form, the word extinct sitting in cold official text on a screen somewhere, and what that word usually meant for anything the Concord found that was not supposed to exist anymore. He had heard whispers from other engineers about specimens sent for archival disposal, and he had never asked what that phrase actually meant, because some part of him had always guessed and never wanted to be right. He looked at the small trembling shapes a moment longer. Then he reached into the duct, slow and careful, the way he might reach for a wire he was not sure was still live, and let his hand rest open on the metal floor beside them. He did not grab. He did not force. He simply waited, breath held, until the smallest of the 3, the one still crying softly, pressed its cold nose against his fingers. Something in his chest loosened, and something else in his chest tightened at the exact same moment, because he understood, without needing to say it aloud, that he had already made his choice. He was not going to file a report. Not tonight. He pulled a spare thermal blanket from his shelf and laid it gently over the 3 of them. tucking the edges down against the duct walls to hold in the warmth. He found half a ration bar in his drawer and broke it into small pieces, setting them within reach without pushing. Then he closed the hatch most of the way, leaving a narrow gap for air, and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, listening to 3 small hearts he could not see beating somewhere beneath the floor. Outside his door, the station carried on as it always did, quiet and orderly, following rules written by people who had never once had to choose between a form and a heartbeat. Daniel sat there a long time, watching the seam in the floor, already knowing that whatever came next, he was not going to be able to walk this back. The frost on the floor had already begun to melt where his boots had crossed it, and by morning the strange little footprints would be gone, as if they had never been there at all. But Daniel would remember exactly where each one had pointed, all the way back to the place where 3 small lives had somehow started, right beneath where he slept, coming from nowhere, but somehow already his to protect. 3 weeks earlier, nobody on Corvus Relay had any reason to think about dragons at all. The survey team had been sent down to the dead world below the station for a routine soil scan. Nothing more. Part of a long list of studies the Concorde ran every few months to track how the planet's poison ground was slowly healing after the war that ended 2 centuries ago. Daniel had gone along only because the survey shuttle needed an engineer in case the old landing gear failed again, and because he liked seeing something other than metal corridors for a few hours. The shelter had not been on any map. It sat half-buried under a collapsed ridge, its entrance hidden by 2 centuries of drifted ash, and the survey team scanners had only caught it by accident, a strange metal echo where the readings said there should be nothing but rock. Daniel had gone in first, since the tunnel was too narrow for the heavier Dravani frames of the rest of the team, and he still remembered the way his hand light had swept across broken shelves, collapsed support beams, and finally, tucked into a corner that had somehow stayed dry and undisturbed, a shallow nest lined with cloth long since turned to dust. Inside the nest were 3 eggs, pale gray, warm to the touch in a way nothing buried under 200 years of cold as should have been. He should have called it in immediately. That was the rule, and he knew the rule, the same way he knew every safety protocol on the station by heart. Any biological find, especially anything connected to a species listed as extinct in Concorde archives, was to be reported untouched and left exactly where it lay for a proper research team to collect. He had opened his comm to do exactly that, thumb already on the channel, when one of the eggs shifted slightly against the cloth, and he heard, faint and unmistakable, a soft tapping sound from inside the shell. He had stood there a long moment, comm still open, saying nothing. He thought about what usually happened to specimens like this. He thought about the word archival, and the quiet way older engineers changed the subject whenever it came up. He thought about a shell tapping from the inside, which meant something inside it was alive and trying to get out. And he thought about handing that over to people who filed it under a case number and studied it in a sealed room somewhere he would never see again. Back on the station, he told no one. He used spare heating coils meant for a different repair job to build a small warm nest inside the disused environmental duct beneath his bed, the same duct he later sealed on paper while leaving it very much open in practice. He adjusted the temperature by hand every few hours, checked the humidity with a borrowed sensor he returned before anyone noticed it was missing, and sat awake more nights than he could count, listening for any sound from inside the shells. 3 days ago, all 3 had hatched within hours of each other, and Daniel had gone from a man who fixed pipes for a living to a man secretly raising 3 baby dragons in the walls of a space station, all without quite deciding to become either. Petra Lindqvist noticed before anyone else did, because Petra noticed everything. She found him in the station kitchen at an hour when no one else was awake, quietly stuffing extra ration packs into his jacket pocket, and she said nothing at first, only watched him with the sharp, patient look she used when running data through her head. It was 2 days later, after she caught him falling asleep standing up during a routine shift and asked, only half joking, whether he had a secret second job, that he finally told her. She did not react the way he expected. She did not gasp or scold him or immediately reach for a comm. She simply asked to see them. He brought her to cabin 4 that night, opened the hatch, and watched her kneel beside the duct in complete silence as 3 small heads lifted toward the light. She reached out slowly, the way he had, and let the smallest one press its nose against her fingers exactly as it had done with him. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and Daniel realized he was holding his breath, waiting to find out whether she would be the one to end this before it had really begun. Instead, she looked up at him, quiet and steady, and said that the Vornith had been extinct for 200 years, extinct meaning gone, meaning studied only through old bones and broken shelters, and that whatever these three were, they should not exist. And yet here they were, warm and breathing and reaching for his hand like he was the only solid thing in the world. She did not ask him to report it. She asked him what he needed to keep them alive. That was the moment the secret stopped being only his. Petra began quietly diverting spare nutrient supplements from the medical stores, adjusting inventory numbers just enough that nothing looked wrong on a casual glance. And Daniel kept adjusting the duck's temperature and feeding schedule, learning slowly, through trial and small mistakes, what 3 growing hatchlings actually needed to thrive. Neither of them said the word illegal out loud, though both knew exactly what they were doing. Neither of them said the word extinction either, though it sat between them anyway, heavy and unspoken. Every time one of the 3 small creatures curled trustingly against Daniel's hand and closed its silver eyes to sleep. A single blinking light on Warden Isolde Cray's console started the whole problem. She had been reviewing routine environmental data, the kind of task she rarely did herself anymore after so many years running Corvus Relay. But a habit from her early career made her check the raw feeds now and then instead of trusting only the summaries. That was how she found it. A small, stubborn anomaly in the heat and biomass readings from level 3, near cabin 4. Readings that made no sense for an area that was supposed to hold nothing but a sleeping engineer and an empty sealed duct. Cray was Dravani, and the Dravani did not chase anomalies with excitement the way some younger species did. She simply opened a quiet inquiry, the kind that involved no alarms and no announcements, only a careful review of logs and a note to keep watching the numbers. Daniel found out about the inquiry from Petra, who found out about it from a friend in station administration who mentioned, almost in passing, that someone was pulling old maintenance records for level 3. Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly under him when he heard it, though nothing on the station had actually moved. He spent the next several days walking a line so careful it exhausted him more than any double shift ever had. He adjusted the duct's heat signature down in small increments, hoping to blend it into the station's normal background noise. He rerouted the leftover nutrient supplements through 3 different inventory codes instead of 1, so no single number would ever look wrong on its own. He checked and rechecked the seal on the hatch every night before letting himself sleep, though sleep came less and less easily the longer this went on. The 3 hatchlings, meanwhile, were growing fast, and growing fast meant growing curious. The smallest one, still the boldest of the 3, learned to work the hatch's simple catch within a week of hatching, and Daniel woke twice to find all 3 gone from the duct entirely, only to trace a fresh set of small clawed prints down the corridor and find them huddled together behind an unused supply crate 2 doors down, drawn by the warmth of a nearby power conduit. Each time, his heart did not slow down properly for hours afterward. The closest call came on a night shift change, when a patrol officer passed within 3 meters of the supply crate, where all 3 hatchlings sat frozen and silent, somehow understanding, without being taught, that stillness meant safety. Daniel had been the one to find them minutes earlier and was crouched just out of sight, one hand pressed flat against the crate, praying in a way he had not done since childhood that the officer would keep walking. The officer did keep walking, boots echoing away down the corridor, and Daniel had sat on the cold floor afterward with all 3 hatchlings pressed against him, shaking nearly as hard as they were. He knew, after that hiding them forever was not a real plan. It had never really been a plan at all, only an instinct he had followed without thinking too far ahead, the same instinct that had made him reach into that duct on the very first night instead of closing the hatch and walking away. So he started looking for something else. Late at night, after the hatchlings had finally settled, he pulled up every public Concord record he could find on extinction law, reading slowly through language written to be difficult, searching for anything that might offer a different ending than the one he feared. Most of what he found only confirmed the worst. Species listed as extinct were considered closed cases, their remains and records archived permanently, any new specimens treated as anomalies to be studied and then, according to one especially cold clause, returned to archival status by whatever method the reviewing council judged appropriate. He read that clause 3 times before he understood what it was actually saying, and after that he did not read it again. But buried deeper in the record, in an old amendment almost nobody seemed to reference anymore, he found a single line that gave him something to hold on to. It stated that any extinct species discovered alive and self-sustaining outside of controlled research conditions could be considered for reclassification as endangered rather than archived, provided sufficient evidence of viability was presented before formal review. The language was old, cautious, clearly written for a situation nobody expected to actually happen, but it was there, a narrow door left slightly open in a wall that otherwise seemed solid. Daniel read it to Petra the next morning, both of them speaking in low voices over a shared meal tray, and for the first time in days he saw something other than worry cross her face. It would not be simple. Sufficient evidence of viability, whatever that meant in practice, would require proof he did not yet have, and proof would require exposing exactly the secret he had spent every waking hour trying to protect. But it was a path, however narrow, and Daniel realized that somewhere in the last 3 days, without quite deciding to, he had stopped hoping only to keep the hatchlings hidden and started hoping instead to find a way they would never have to be hidden again. He did not know yet that the choice would be taken out of his hands within the week, or that it would happen not through careful planning, but through disaster, in the worst possible moment, in front of the very people whose approval he needed most. The warning alarm that tore through Corvus Relay that afternoon had nothing to do with dragons at all, at least not at first. A coolant line running behind the station's aging power core had corroded through a weld point nobody had inspected in years, one of many small scars left over from damage the station sustained decades ago during the same war that wiped out the world below it. The leak started slow, a thin hiss of pressurized coolant escaping into a maintenance gap, but within minutes the automated containment system meant to seal the breach failed to trigger, its old wiring finally giving out after years of quiet strain nobody had caught in time. Daniel was 3 decks away when the alarm sounded, and he was running toward the power core before he had fully finished reading the alert on his wrist display. Coolant breaches near a power core were the kind of emergency every engineer trained for and hoped never to actually face, because a large enough leak could crack the core housing itself, and a cracked core housing on a station this old meant an evacuation nobody was fully prepared to carry out in time. He reached the affected section to find Warden Cray already there, calm and precise even now, directing 2 other engineers toward manual shutoff valves, while a containment team worked to physically patch the breach before the coolant reserves ran dangerously low. The problem, Daniel realized within seconds of studying the schematics on his wrist display, was the gap itself. The breach sat behind a tangle of old support struts and narrow conduit space, a gap too small for any human or Dravani hand to reach, in a section too unstable to risk cutting open further without worsening the leak. Every proposed fix required tools or hands that could not fit, and the coolant levels were falling faster than anyone had projected. Daniel felt the cold weight of an idea settle into his chest before he had even fully decided to act on it. He thought of 3 small shapes that had spent their first hours in the dark, ash-choked ruins of a dead world's underground shelters, creatures built by evolution itself to move through exactly this kind of narrow, dangerous space. He thought of how easily the smallest one slipped through gaps that should have been impossible for it, how naturally all 3 seemed to sense heat and airflow through spaces Daniel could barely see into with a scope. He did not have time to weigh the risk properly. He simply ran. He reached cabin 4 in under a minute, pulled the hatch open, and found all 3 hatchlings already awake and restless, clearly able to sense something wrong through the station's shifting air pressure long before any alarm reached them. He knelt beside the duct, hands shaking slightly, and spoke to them in the low, steady voice he had used every night since they hatched, though he had no real way to know if they understood him at all. He showed them the small patch kit clipped to his belt, guided the smallest one's clawed foot gently toward it, and hoped, more than he had ever hoped for anything, that instinct would do what training could not. Back at the breach site, Daniel arrived with all 3 hatchlings wrapped carefully inside his jacket, drawing startled looks from every engineer present and a single sharp glance from Warden Cray that promised a difficult conversation later. There was no time for explanations. Daniel knelt at the edge of the narrow gap, opened his jacket, and let the smallest hatchling go first. It hesitated only a moment before diving into the gap, small claws finding purchase on the old strut framework with an ease that made two engineers audibly gasp. The second followed, then the third, moving through the space like they had been born to navigate exactly this kind of ruin, which, Daniel realized with a strange ache in his chest, they very nearly had. He fed the patch kit through a narrow access slot, guiding it by voice and by the faint tug of a thin cable he had tied to the smallest one's foreleg, watching numbers on his wrist display with a focus so total he forgot to breathe. It took 4 long minutes. For minutes of coolant alarms screaming, for minutes of Warden Cray standing rigid beside him, saying nothing, watching everything, for minutes of 3 small creatures crawling through broken metal on behalf of a station that, by every written rule the Concord had, was not supposed to know they existed at all. Then the pressure numbers on Daniel's display began to climb back toward stable, and a moment later the smallest hatchling emerged from the gap first, exhausted and trembling, followed quickly by the other 2, all 3 immediately pressing themselves against Daniel's legs as though seeking safety in the only shape they trusted. The alarm cut off. The corridor fell into a silence far louder than the alarm had ever been. Daniel looked up slowly and found nearly a dozen station personnel staring at him, and at the 3 small creatures pressed against his legs, creatures that every Concord record insisted could not possibly exist. Warden Cray's expression gave away nothing, though her eyes moved slowly from the hatchlings to Daniel and back again, calculating something he could not read. She did not shout. She did not immediately call for security. She simply said, in a voice quiet enough that only he could hear it clearly, that he had a great deal to explain, and that he would be explaining it formally, very soon, to people who would not be nearly as patient as she was choosing to be in this exact moment. Daniel nodded, too tired and too relieved to feel the fear that should have come with those words, and for the first time in days, he did not have to hide anything at all. The hearing room on Corvus Relay had not been used in years, and someone had to clean 2 centuries of dust off the long curved table before Counselor Thessaly would agree to sit at it. She had arrived less than a day after the coolant breach, summoned by a report Warden Cray herself had filed, worded carefully enough to describe what happened without either condemning or defending Daniel outright. Thessaly was Dravani, older than Cray by at least a century, with the kind of stillness that came from decades spent enforcing rules she had watched break entire species apart when they were ignored. She did not raise her voice once during the entire hearing. She did not need to. Daniel stood near the center of the room, Petra beside him, both of them having agreed the night before that whatever happened, they would answer everything honestly, without excuses dressed up as explanations. Warden Cray sat to one side, technically neutral, though everyone in the room understood her testimony would carry weight neither Daniel nor Petra could claim on their own. Thessaly began by stating the facts plainly, without any visible anger, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. She described the discovery of the eggs, the decision not to report them, the months of hidden feeding schedules and falsified inventory records, and the deliberate concealment of a species the Concord had formally closed as extinct following a war that had cost both sides more than either had ever fully recovered from. She reminded the room, quietly, that the treaty ending that war rested in part on an agreement that certain matters, including the fate of the Vornith, would remain settled and undisturbed, out of respect for old grief on both sides. Reviving a closed species, she said, was not simply a scientific question. It was a wound reopened without permission, on behalf of people who had spent 2 centuries learning to live with what they had lost. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Thessaly finally turned to him and asked whether he understood the weight of what he had done, he answered honestly that he understood it more now than he had on the very first night, when all he had known was that something small and frightened needed help, and there had been no time to file the correct form first. He did not apologize for keeping them alive. He said so plainly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest, and explained that he had spent every night since deciding whether he had made the right choice, and had come to only one honest answer, that no law, however carefully written, should require a person to let 3 living creatures die simply because the paperwork had not caught up to the fact that they existed. Thessaly's expression did not soften, but she did not interrupt him either. Petra spoke next, calm and precise the way she always was, laying out the small amount of viability evidence they had managed to gather in the short time since the breach: growth records, feeding patterns, behavioral notes documenting instincts the Vornith were known to have possessed before their extinction. It was not much. It was, she admitted honestly, far less than any proper research team would normally require. But it was real, and it was more evidence of a living Vornith population than had existed anywhere in the galaxy for 200 years. Then Warden Cray rose to speak, and the room went very still. She did not defend Daniel's methods. She stated clearly that concealment and falsified records were serious violations, and that under different circumstances she would have recommended severe discipline without hesitation. But she also described, in careful detail, the 4 minutes during the coolant breach when 3 small creatures no larger than her forearm had done what no engineer, no drone, and no piece of station equipment could do, moving through a gap too narrow and too unstable for anything else, saving a station of over 300 people from a failure that would have cost far more than any treaty violation ever could. She said that she had spent her career trusting precedent over instinct, and that watching those 3 hatchlings work that day had been the first time in a long while she had seriously questioned whether precedent alone was still serving the purpose it was meant to serve. Thessaly listened to all of it in silence, her long fingers steepled on the dusty table, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried none of the sharp certainty it had held at the start of the hearing. She said that the Concord's caution around the Vornith had always been meant to prevent further harm, not to guarantee further loss, and that watching this room, human and Dravani alike, argue so fiercely for the survival of a species everyone else had quietly agreed to let stay dead, was not something the original treaty writers had ever accounted for. She made no ruling that day. She said only that the matter would go before the full council, and that Daniel's actions, reckless as they were, had at least produced something no archive ever could: proof, however small, that the Vornith were not only remembered, but alive, and that somewhere in the space between old grief and old law, someone still needed to decide what to do about that. Daniel left the hearing room that evening with no guarantee of anything, only the quiet, exhausted certainty that he would make the exact same choice again, every single time, no matter what the council eventually decided. Word from the full Concord Council took 11 days to arrive, and every one of those days felt longer than the last to Daniel, who spent them doing ordinary maintenance work with a mind that refused to focus on anything ordinary at all. He was not confined to quarters, and the 3 hatchlings were not taken from him, which Petra pointed out more than once was probably a better sign than either of them wanted to admit out loud in case saying it too soon somehow ruined it. Daniel kept feeding them, kept watching them grow steadier on their feet each day, kept catching himself talking to them about the hearing as though they could understand every word, which, given everything else that had happened, he was no longer entirely sure they couldn't. The message finally arrived on a quiet morning, routed directly to Warden Cray's console before being shared with Daniel in a small briefing room that felt far too large for the 2 of them and Petra standing beside him. The council's ruling was longer and more carefully worded than Daniel expected, filled with references to old treaty language and precedent he barely understood, but the core of it came down to a single sentence Cray read aloud slowly, watching Daniel's face as she did. The Vornith were to be formally reclassified from extinct and archived to endangered and protected, the first such reclassification in Concord history made on the basis of a living, verified population rather than a controlled research revival. Daniel did not fully process the words the first time he heard them. Petra had to repeat the second half of the sentence back to him before it landed properly, and even then he found himself asking Cray to confirm it a second time, unable to quite believe that the narrow, uncertain door he had found buried in old legal language weeks ago had actually held. The ruling was not without consequence. Daniel received a formal reprimand for concealment and falsification of station records, a mark that would follow his service history for years, and Petra received a lesser reprimand for her role in helping him. Neither of them argued the point, Both had known from the start that some price would come due, and a reprimand, they agreed quietly afterward, was a far smaller price than either had feared paying only days earlier. What came with the reprimand, though, was something neither of them had expected. The council granted Daniel formal guardianship status over the 3 surviving Vornith, an unusual designation typically reserved for licensed xenobiologists, allowing him to continue raising them under proper Concord oversight rather than handing them over to a research team that would have studied them at a careful, clinical distance. Alongside the guardianship came a small team of actual Vornith researchers, arriving within the month, tasked not with archiving the species this time, but with learning how to help it survive and, eventually, grow. Warden Cray, reading the final section of the ruling aloud, paused slightly over one particular line before finishing it. The council's decision, it stated, had been influenced significantly by testimony describing the species' demonstrated value and behavior during the Corvus Relay coolant emergency, and by the station commander's own account of events. Cray did not comment further on that line, only set the datapad down and looked at Daniel with an expression that, for the first time since he had known her, looked almost like approval. Months passed differently after that. The 3 hatchlings, no longer needing to be hidden in a sealed duct beneath a narrow bed, moved instead into a proper habitat built into a converted storage bay near the station's observation deck, larger, warmer, and filled with the kind of rough terrain features the new research team believed would help them develop the strength and instincts their species had once relied on. Daniel visited every day, sometimes twice, and the small research team quickly learned to simply let him, since the hatchlings responded to almost nothing as readily as they responded to him. They grew steadier. Their claws hardened. Their wings, still too small for flight, began to unfold fully for the first time, stretching wide during long stretches of sunlight that streamed in through the observation deck's wide viewport, the same sunlight that had never once touched them during their first hidden weeks aboard the station. On a quiet afternoon almost a year after the frost first froze into strange shapes on his cabin floor, Daniel stood at the observation deck's edge and watched all 3 of them cross the open habitat floor together, leaving a fresh trail of small clawed prints behind them in the fine dust laid down to mimic their ancestors' world. The prints did not circle back toward hiding this time. They led outward, toward the light, toward open space, toward a future that 200 years of careful, cautious archiving had never once imagined possible. Petra joined him at the railing without a word, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, watching 3 creatures that were never supposed to exist walk freely under open light because one tired engineer, on one ordinary night, had chosen not to close a hatch and walk away. Somewhere behind them, Warden Cray watched too, quiet and unreadable as always, though anyone who knew her well enough might have noticed that she no longer looked at the 3 Vornith the way she looked at an anomaly in her reports. She looked at them the way a person looks at something worth having fought to keep.